The stars had never felt so quiet. Executor Kale Voss stood at the viewport of his command vessel, the Eternal Dominion, watching the small blue-green planet rotate slowly below him. It was unremarkable by any galactic standard, mostly water, modest landmasses, a thin protective atmosphere that a decent orbital bombardment could strip in hours. His scanners showed primitive energy signatures, radio wave communications, and weapons technology that his empire had surpassed 4,000 years ago. He almost felt sorry for them. Almost. "Transmission ready, Executor," his communications officer reported, mandibles clicking with professional efficiency. "Send it." The ultimatum was a formality. It always was. In 300 years of expansion, the Vreth Dominion had absorbed 61 civilizations. The process was always the same: arrive, transmit the instrument of annexation, allow 48 hours for the inevitable capitulation, then begin integration. Some species wept. Some prayed. The Oro had actually applauded, believing the Dominion's arrival was the fulfillment of a religious prophecy. None of them had ever said no. The concept hadn't been built into the protocol. The instrument of annexation was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. It opened with an exhaustive list of the Dominion's military assets: 40,000 warships, 300 subjugated worlds, a standing army numbered in the billions. It then detailed in clinical precision what resistance would mean: orbital bombardment, resource extraction, the dissolution of their governing bodies. It closed with a single sentence that had broken the spirit of every species that had ever read it. Compliance is the only path to survival. Kale Voss watched the transmission confirmed, then settled into his command chair and ordered tea. He gave them 48 hours out of procedural obligation. He expected to be filing integration paperwork within 30. What he did not expect was the response that came back 11 hours later. It was not a surrender. It was not a plea for mercy or a desperate counteroffer. It was a single, formally worded message, delivered in 37 different human languages before finally appearing in Vreth Standard, which meant they had possessed a translation matrix for his species and had been studying them long before this moment. That alone should have given him pause. To the Vreth Dominion, we have received and reviewed your instrument of annexation. Representatives of the United Earth Government require 72 hours to prepare a formal response. We ask that your vessels maintain their current position and refrain from entering our atmosphere during this period. We thank you for your patience. Secretary General Amara Osai, United Earth Government. Kale Voss read it 3 times. They weren't surrendering. They weren't screaming. They were asking for more time, not to mourn, not to pray, but to prepare a formal response. As if this were a trade negotiation. As if the most powerful military force in the known galaxy had knocked on their door and they had simply asked it to wait in the hallway while they finished their tea. "Executor," his tactical officer said carefully, "should we proceed with the standard psychological disruption broadcast? Low-frequency bombardment of communication satellites, perhaps a—" "No," Kale Voss said slowly, still staring at the message. "Grant them their 72 hours. His officers exchanged glances. It was an unusual decision. But Kale Voss had not survived 30 years in Dominion service by ignoring things that felt wrong. And something about this felt deeply, profoundly wrong. He pulled up everything his intelligence division had compiled on humanity. The files were thin. The Dominion scouts had only been observing Earth for a decade. But what was there was curious. These creatures had a history unlike any species he had encountered. They had nearly wiped themselves out no fewer than 6 times in the last century alone: wars, biological catastrophes, ecological collapse, and every single time they had rebuilt, not just survived. Rebuilt, taller, faster, more organized. He found a fragment of a human text, translated poorly by an automated system that made him pause. It was old, several centuries by their calendar. A military strategist named Sun Tzu. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. They had war philosophers, ancient ones. He flagged the file and leaned back, looking again at the small blue planet. 61 civilizations. Not one had asked for time, not one had responded with calm, not one had already known his language before he spoke. 72 hours, he thought, fine. He had absolutely no idea that in those 72 hours, the world below him was about to do something no species in the galaxy had ever done before. Prepare, the first hour was chaos. Not the chaos of fear, though fear was present, threaded through every emergency broadcast, every hastily convened parliamentary session, every family huddled around screens watching the Vreth fleet hang in orbit like a cluster of silver knives. It was the chaos of a species that had been preparing for this moment in secret for years, and was now finally, terrifyingly, allowed to move. Deep beneath the Swiss Alps, in a facility that officially didn't exist, General Yusuf Tariq of the United Earth Defense Command slammed his palm on a biometric reader and stepped into the war room for the first time in a non-drill capacity. The room hummed to life around him, holographic displays painting the walls in blue light, officers already at their stations, voices overlapping in a dozen languages before the translation systems smoothed them into unified English. DEFCON Omega is confirmed, his aide said, barely keeping pace with his stride. All commands have acknowledged. Shipyards running at 240% standard capacity. We've pulled civilian construction crews and retasked the automated orbital platforms. The Defiance is being fast-tracked. Engineers say they can shave 4 months off the timeline if we skip secondary weapons testing. Skip it, Tariq said without hesitation. This was the thing the Vreth Dominion couldn't know, because they had never bothered to look closely enough. Humanity had been watching the stars for a long time, and when their deep space listening arrays had picked up the Dominion's communication signatures 8 years ago, still 30 light years out, still years from arrival, the United Earth government had made a quiet, unanimous, and deeply serious decision. They would not repeat the mistakes of history. Every conquered civilization the Dominion had absorbed shared one fatal trait. They had been caught unprepared. They had looked up and seen the fleet and had nothing to answer it with. Earth's governments, for once in their fractious, argumentative, beautifully stubborn history, had agreed on something. If the Dominion ever came, humanity would meet it armed. The shipyards on the dark side of the moon, built under the cover of a long-term astronomical research program, had been quietly producing warships for 6 years. They weren't as advanced as Vreth vessels. They didn't need to be, they just needed to be good enough, and there needed to be enough of them. Meanwhile, Earth's finest physicists had been reverse engineering every scrap of alien technology intercepted from Dominion communications, constructing theoretical frameworks for FTL travel, directed energy weapons, and adaptive shielding. They weren't ready, they had hoped for another decade. But humans, more than any species in the galaxy, were experienced at fighting before they were ready. In the 72 hours that followed, the world moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. Civilian airspace was cleared globally, naval fleets repositioned, underground bunkers that had been stocked and sealed years ago were cracked open and staffed. Every nuclear-capable nation transferred warhead authority to the unified command structure without a single political argument, a miracle that, under any other circumstances, would have been historically impossible. And then there was the message network. Through channels the Dominion couldn't intercept, old submarine cable frequencies, laser pulse communications between deep space probes, word reached 3 species within the Dominion's territory that something extraordinary was happening on a small blue planet. The Thavari observer stationed near Neptune's orbit sent a single encrypted burst to his hidden relay. They are not surrendering. They are arming. The response from his contact, a sane resistance member 3 star systems away, came back 4 hours later. That's impossible. Watch, he replied. On hour 71, a Vreth scout drone, a small, spider-like surveillance unit, detached from the fleet and began a slow descent toward Earth's upper atmosphere. It was standard procedure, a last-chance scan to confirm the expected capitulation signatures, the shutdown of military systems, the dispersal of any armed groups. It was professionally, politely shot down by a rail-accelerated projectile from a ground installation in northern Canada. Clean, deliberate, no wasted shot. 20 minutes later, Secretary General Osai's voice went out on every frequency the Dominion monitored. To the Vreth Dominion, your surveillance unit entered sovereign Earth airspace without authorization and was neutralized accordingly. Your 72-hour window has expired. After full deliberation by the United Earth Government and all member nations, our formal response to the instrument of annexation is as follows. A pause short, but loaded with the weight of 8 billion people. No. In orbit, Executor Kael'va sat very still in his command chair. His tea had gone cold an hour ago. His tactical officer was speaking, something about fleet formations, punitive strike coordinates, standard suppression protocols. Kale Voss heard none of it. He was staring at his scanner readout, which was telling him something that his mind genuinely struggled to accept. In 72 hours, Earth's orbital defense signature had increased by 340%. They hadn't been preparing to surrender. They hadn't been saying goodbye to their families or making peace with their gods. They had been building. Executor, his tactical officer prompted, "Your orders." Kale Voss closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and in that brief darkness felt something he had not felt since he was a young soldier on his very first campaign. A chill. "Deploy the destroyers," he said quietly. "Standard punitive formation." He told himself it would be over quickly. He was wrong. 3 Vreth destroyers dropped out of FTL with the casual arrogance of apex predators, weapons hot, shields at minimum because shields at full power were for enemies who could actually threaten you. The lead vessel, the Crusher of Weak Resolve, had participated in the annexation of 9 civilizations. Its commander, Shiplord Rethavon, had never personally witnessed a battle. He had witnessed suppressions. There was a difference. Battles implied 2 sides. Suppressions were administrative. He expected to find panicked civilian ships scattering in every direction, maybe a few primitive military vessels making a symbolic gesture before being vaporized. The kind of brave, doomed, meaningless last stand that the Dominion's historians documented with a mixture of pity and mild admiration. What he found instead was a line. 34 human warships, arranged in a defensive formation that his tactical computer took 4 full seconds to analyze, an eternity in combat terms, because the formation didn't match any pattern in the Dominion's database. It was something new. The humans had clearly studied Vreth attack patterns from intercepted data and built a counterformation from scratch, one specifically designed to funnel incoming fire into overlapping defensive fields while concentrating return fire on a narrow targeting corridor. Whoever had designed it knew exactly what they were doing. "Sir," his tactical officer said, mandibles tight with something approaching unease, "they're not moving." "Of course they're not," Rethavon said, but his certainty had developed a hairline crack. "They're terrified, frozen, begin the suppression sweep." The Crusher of Weak Resolve opened fire. What followed was the most expensive 20 minutes in Vreth Dominion history. The human ships took damage, severe damage. 3 were destroyed outright in the first exchange, their hulls cracking open against directed energy fire that their shielding wasn't quite strong enough to stop. But they didn't run. They returned fire with a ferocity that was almost incomprehensible, pouring everything they had into the targeting corridor their formation had created. Human missiles, primitive chemical propellant things that should have been laughable, had been modified with guidance systems reverse-engineered from Dominion drone technology. They hit with uncomfortable accuracy. The Unbroken Vow, the Dominion's 2nd destroyer, took a coordinated strike to its port engine assembly from 6 human vessels firing in synchronized sequence. The timing was so precise that the Unbroken Vow's adaptive shielding, designed to handle 1 impact at a time, couldn't redistribute fast enough. The engine housing cracked, not catastrophically, but enough. Rethavon watched his damage reports with growing disbelief. They were winning, technically. The humans were taking heavier losses, their ships were outmatched in nearly every technical category, and the eventual outcome of this engagement was not in doubt. But they were supposed to break. Every species broke at a certain threshold, the moment when the math of survival became undeniable and the instinct to live outweighed the will to resist. The humans crossed that threshold, looked directly at the math, and kept fighting anyway. "The Unbroken Vow is withdrawing, sir. Structural damage to the secondary drive." "Order them to hold position." "They can't, sir. The damage is too severe." 2 destroyers and 1 limping away, and the human line had not broken. Rethavon did what his orders required. He completed the bombardment of a coastal city on the large continent the humans called Africa. It was a message, a reminder of cost, the kind of devastating blow that historically shattered morale, sent populations fleeing, broke governments. The Crusher and its remaining companion withdrew to the fleet. Below, on the burning coastline, rescue operations began within minutes of the bombardment ending. Not in hours. Minutes. Emergency services, civilian volunteers, military units, all moving with the coordinated urgency of a species that had, tragically, a great deal of practice at this. And then the cameras went back up. The feeds went live on every human broadcast channel. Not to show despair, not to show surrender. To show the faces of the people rebuilding. In the war room beneath the Alps, General Tarek stood before his assembled command staff, looking at the casualty reports. The numbers were brutal. He let himself truly feel it, for exactly 30 seconds. It was a discipline he had taught himself years ago. Grief deserved its moment. Then it had to be folded away because there was work to do. Damage assessment on the unbroken vow, he asked. Our intelligence estimates their port drive at 15 to 20% capacity. If they try FTL in that condition, they'll tear themselves apart, Tarek finished. He looked at the tactical display. What did we learn? His chief weapons analyst, Dr. Priya Nair, stepped forward. She had been awake for 40 hours and looked it, but her eyes were sharp. Their shielding uses a resonance distribution system. It's fast, but it's sequential, not simultaneous. If you hit the same point with multiple synchronized strikes inside a 0.3-second window, the system can't compensate. You confirmed that in live combat. I designed the targeting sequence for the unbroken vow strike, she said simply. Tarek looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Get some sleep, 4 hours, then I need you back at that board. Across the planet, in living rooms and shelters and military barracks, humans watched the footage of the battle, their ships destroyed, their city burning, their dead being counted. There was grief. There was rage. There was fear, deep and real and honest. But there was something else, too. Something that had been forged in centuries of surviving the unsurvivable, of rebuilding after every catastrophe, of looking at impossible odds and finding, somewhere in the stubborn architecture of the human soul, the absolute refusal to accept defeat. The comments flooding Earth's networks that night weren't cries for surrender. They were promises. In orbit, Executor Kale Voss reviewed Rethavan's battle report for the 3rd time. He pulled up the historical database of every Dominion annexation, 61 species, hundreds of individual engagements. He searched for any record of a species absorbing those kinds of losses and maintaining formation coherence. He found nothing, not one entry. He opened a private channel to the Dominion's high command and spoke 4 words he had never spoken in his career. We have a problem. Prisoner smelled like cold metal and something vaguely medicinal. The result of 3 weeks in a human detention facility that was, by Vreth standards, remarkably humane. Ship Weapons Officer Denthral had expected a cage. What he had gotten was a room, small, yes, and monitored constantly, but with a bed that accommodated his physiology, food that his handlers had gone to visible effort to make edible, and a window that looked out on a gray mountain range wrapped in early morning cloud. He had been told he would not be harmed. He had been told this by a human female in military uniform who looked him directly in the compound eyes, a gesture of dominance in Vreth culture, but one she seemed to mean simply as directness, and spoke in passable Vreth standard with an accent that suggested she had learned it from recordings rather than speakers. He had believed her, which had unsettled him more than the capture itself. The Vreth knew many things about war. They did not know much about prisoners because their wars were suppressions, and suppressions didn't generate prisoners, they generated statistics. Being taken was new. Being fed afterward was genuinely novel. On the 22nd day, Colonel Adiz Okonkwo came to talk to him. She was a tall woman, tall even by human standards, which Denthral had come to understand was saying something, as humans had considerable variation in physical size. She carried a tablet and a cup of something hot and sat across from him at the small table as if this were a meeting between colleagues. No guards inside the room, though he knew from the corners of the ceiling that there were eyes everywhere. You've been asking questions, she said. The staff told me. I have been curious, Denthral said carefully. About what? About why you haven't broken. The colonel looked at him for a moment, then set her tablet on the table and turned it to face him. The screen showed text and images, dense, historical, the translation running in the margin in halting Vreth standard. Do you know what this is? He studied it, maps, conflict zones, numbers in the millions, a war record. 40 years of war, she said. One of ours, early 20th century by our calendar, 2 conflicts back to back, combined death toll somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, We don't have an exact number because the record-keeping broke down in places. She swiped. More images, cities reduced to rubble, fields of crosses and monuments. This is what we did to ourselves. Denthral was quiet. She kept swiping. Plagues that had killed tens of millions, famines, civilizational collapses in ancient history, empires that had spanned continents gone in a generation, climate events, volcanic winters. We have come close to extinction, she said, by rough estimate at least a dozen times. Disease, war, ecological failure, our own weapons. Every single time, she paused and looked at him. We're still here. Why are you showing me this? He asked. Because I want you to understand something that your executor doesn't. She leaned forward slightly. You came here expecting to find a species that had never suffered, something soft, something that would look at your fleet and calculate the odds and make the rational choice to submit. She closed the tablet. You found a species that has spent its entire existence being nearly destroyed by each other, by nature, by circumstance, and rebuilding every single time. We don't break at a casualty threshold, ship officer, because we have already exceeded every casualty threshold that should have ended us. We've been past the breaking point so many times that we stopped recognizing it as the breaking point. The room was very quiet. Your historians, Denthral said slowly, they documented all of this. Obsessively, the colonel said, with a strange note in her voice that he would later identify as rueful pride. We study our disasters, we name them, we build monuments to them, we teach them to children so they remember. She stood. We don't study them because we're morbid, ship officer. We study them because every time we nearly died, we learned something, and we kept all of it. She picked up the tablet, then paused at the door. You asked why we haven't broken, she said. The honest answer is that we don't fully understand it ourselves. Some of our scientists think it's evolutionary, that we come from a more dangerous planet than most, that our psychology was shaped by a world that was actively trying to kill us long before we had tools to fight back. Others think it's cultural, that we've built societies specifically structured around persisting through catastrophe. She looked at him over her shoulder. Most of us think it's just stubbornness. After she left, Denthral sat in the quiet room with the mountain view for a long time. He thought about the battle report he had filed 3 weeks ago before his ship was disabled. He thought about the human vessels that had maintained formation while burning. He thought about the rescue operations that had begun within minutes of a city being bombed. He thought about the tablet and its parade of catastrophes, and the stubborn, baffling, almost offensive fact that the species responsible for all of them was still here, still building ships, still looking up at the Vreth fleet, and saying no with the calm of people who had already survived the end of the world more times than they could accurately count. That evening, he asked his human handlers if he could send a message. They said they would consider it. He told them what he wanted to say, that the Dominion was making a mistake, that Kael'vas needed to be told, that this was not a suppression but something different, something the Dominion had no doctrine for. The young human soldier who took down his words nodded slowly, then looked up with an expression Denthral couldn't quite read. Don't worry, the soldier said quietly. They're starting to figure that out. 11,000 kilometers away in the lunar shipyards, the INS Defiance, Earth's first FDL-capable warship, completed its primary systems test. 3 months ahead of schedule. The crew ran diagnostics through the night, hands moving fast, voices clipped and professional, with the focused energy of people who knew exactly what was at stake. At 400 hours, the Defiance powered up its FTL drive for the first time. It worked. In the war room, General Tarek received the confirmation, closed his eyes briefly, and allowed himself one slow breath. Then he opened them and began planning what came next. The meeting happened in the dark between stars. Specifically, in the sensor shadow of a brown dwarf catalogued in human astronomy as WISE 10495319, close enough to know one's territory to be technically neutral, dark enough to be nearly invisible to passive scanning, cold enough that any thermal signature would be lost in the background radiation. It was the kind of place you chose when you absolutely could not afford to be found. The INS Defiance arrived first, running dark, every non-essential system powered down. Commander Rania Vasquez stood at the bridge viewport and watched the nothing outside, pure black, no stars close enough to see, just the faint suggestion of the dwarf's mass curving the distant light. She had been told to wait. She waited. The Thavari ship arrived second. It was smaller than she had expected, a converted cargo runner, battered and mismatched with 3 different hull plate generations visible from the outside, the kind of ship that no one looked at twice in a busy port. Which was, she understood, the entire point. The Seine came third, in a vessel so thoroughly camouflaged that the Defiance's sensors registered it as a debris cluster until it began actively transmitting the agreed recognition code. The Oro delegate, impossibly, was already there, had apparently been waiting for 6 days inside the shadow of the brown dwarf in a single-occupancy life pod, wrapped in thermal insulation, surviving on compressed rations, having traveled the last leg of the journey alone to avoid leaving any trail that could be followed back to his people. Vasquez thought about that on the walk to the docking bay. The image of a small alien creature sitting alone in a tin can between the stars for 6 days, eating protein paced in the dark, waiting for a species he had never met in person because he believed they were worth the wait. She tucked the thought away somewhere important and stepped through the airlock. The conference room was small. 4 species around a table designed for humans, 3 of them using furniture that didn't quite fit their physiology, all of them watching her with expressions that translated across the biological divide into something she recognized clearly. Desperate, fragile, terrifying hope. She didn't make them wait. "Earth is still standing," she said. "We took damage, we lost people, we are still standing." The Thavari delegate, a gray-feathered being named Selarath, whose species had been under Dominion control for 160 years, made a sound that the translation system rendered as a long, shuddering exhale, like something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, just slightly released. "We know," Selarath said. "We have been watching, through channels the Dominion cannot monitor." She paused. "We have been watching for the last 6 years, since we intercepted your military communications and understood what you were building." Vasquez kept her face neutral. "You've known for 6 years." "We hoped," Selarath said simply. "We were afraid to do more than hope. Hope is," she seemed to search for words, "survivable if it fails, action is not." The Seine delegate, a compact, insected being named Char leaned forward on 4 of its 6 limbs. "You want information, we have information. We want liberation. You are perhaps capable of liberation. This is the simplest exchange in the history of our peoples." "Tell me what you have," Vasquez said. What they had was extraordinary. 160 years of careful, invisible, painstakingly gathered intelligence, fleet movement patterns, supply chain architecture, the rotation schedules of Dominion border patrols, the maintenance cycles of their deep space relay networks, the location of every Dominion shipyard within 30 light years, the personal communication codes of 6 high executors, and most critically, the location of the Dominion's Central Command Nexus, the single facility from which all Dominion military operations were coordinated, the destruction of which would not end the war but would blind the Dominion's strategic command for months. They had been collecting it because they believed, with the specific stubborn faith of the long oppressed, that someday someone would need it. "Why us?" Vasquez asked. Not skeptically, she genuinely needed to understand. It was the Oro who answered. He was small, barely a meter tall, covered in rust-colored scales, with 4 forward-facing eyes that gave him an oddly owl-like expression. He had spent 6 days alone in a life pod to be in this room. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and the translation came through with a gravity that made the room feel heavier. "Because you are the first species the Dominion has encountered that said no," he said. "In all of recorded history and all of the Dominion's expansion, no one has said no. We did not. We were afraid and we did not, and now our children are born into chains and they have never known anything else." He looked at Vasquez steadily. "You said no, and you are still here, and so we ask you, do you believe you can win?" The room was absolutely silent. Vasquez thought about the Defiance, the ship she had helped build, had trained on, had pushed 3 months past what the engineers thought was possible. She thought about General Tarek's face when the FTL test came back positive. She thought about Dr. Nair designing a weapons solution in the middle of a firefight, running on 40 hours without sleep, and being right. She thought about Colonel Okonkwo's words, relayed in a mission brief, "We don't break at a casualty threshold." She looked at the Oro delegate, small and scaled, and having spent 6 days in a tin can in the dark for this moment, and told him the truth. "Honestly, I don't know," she said. "The odds are not good, we're outgunned, we're still technologically behind, and we've taken losses we can't easily replace." She paused. But I'll tell you what I do know. Humanity has been in situations like this before, worse in some ways, and we've always found a way. Not because we're smarter or stronger, because we're too stubborn to quit, and we're very, very good at learning while we're losing. She leaned forward. Your intelligence changes our odds significantly. With what you're offering us, we can stop reacting and start choosing where this war goes. She looked around the table. I can't promise you victory, but I can promise you that if you help us, we will spend everything we have trying to earn it. And if we win, when we win, no one at this table will still be in chains. Selarath's feathers shifted, an expression the translation system flagged as complex, mixing grief and determination, and something it labeled cautiously as renewed faith. Then we have an agreement, she said. The resistance network was born in the shadow of a dead star, at a table that didn't fit anyone perfectly, between four species who had every reason to distrust each other and one remarkable reason not to. That reason was still standing on a small blue planet, building warships and refusing to negotiate its own surrender. It turned out that was enough. The Dominion had never been struck in its own territory. This was not for lack of enemies. In 300 years of expansion, the Vreth had accumulated plenty of those. It was simply that none of those enemies had ever possessed the reach, the will, or the specific combination of reckless courage and meticulous planning required to bring the war to the Dominion's doorstep. The Dominion's core worlds had become, over centuries, psychologically untouchable, the safe center around which wars happened at a comfortable distance, the place where high executors made decisions about other people's suffering without ever being required to experience any of their own. General Tarek understood this. He had studied the Dominion's psychology with the same obsessive thoroughness that humanity applied to everything it needed to defeat, and he had identified what he called the comfort gap, the distance between the Dominion's military confidence and their emotional preparation for genuine consequence. They were powerful. They had never been hurt. Those were not the same thing. The plan he built around this insight was elegant in its simplicity. He didn't need to destroy a fleet. He needed to destroy a feeling. The Vreth Dominion's primary automated resupply depot, logistics station Keth 7, sat in a system 12 light-years from Earth, deep enough in Dominion space that no enemy had ever come close to threatening it. It was enormous, a platform 5 kilometers long, responsible for fueling and rearming 30% of the Dominion's active patrol fleet. It was also, thanks to Thavari intelligence, almost entirely automated, a skeleton crew of fewer than 200 personnel. No dedicated defense fleet, just 2 patrol frigates that rotated through on a 6-day cycle, and the cycle's timing was in the data Selarath had handed over. Tarek sent the Defiance and 4 supporting vessels, all running dark. Commander Vasquez brought them out of FTL at the edge of the system during the patrol rotation gap, a 4-hour window when Keth 7 had no military escort. She gave the crew 3 minutes to verify the intelligence was accurate. It was. The depot hung in space exactly where the Thavari said it would be, enormous and lit and utterly unaware. Signal the crew, her communications officer asked. Standard warning protocol, Vasquez said. They get 10 minutes to evacuate. We're not here to kill maintenance workers. Her tactical officer looked up from his station. Commander, that gives them time to. Send the warning, she said. The warning went out. 8 minutes later, emergency pods were jettisoning from the station in clusters, crew evacuating with impressive speed, Vasquez noted, giving the Vreth some grudging credit for their emergency drill discipline. At the 9-minute mark, she ordered the strike. The Defiance and its 4 companions hit Keth 7 with everything they had, targeting the fuel storage arrays first. When they went, the chain reaction they triggered was visible from the outer edge of the system. The depot came apart in a sequence of expanding plasma blooms, each one swallowing the last, until the entire 5-kilometer structure was simply gone, leaving a spreading cloud of debris and superheated gas where something the size of a small city had been. Vasquez watched it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she opened a channel on every frequency the Dominion monitored, and several they didn't know humans knew about, courtesy of sane intelligence, and spoke with the calm of someone reading a weather report. This is Commander Rainia Vasquez of the INS Defiance, United Earth Defense Command. Logistics Station Keth 7 has been destroyed. Crew casualties are minimal. We gave them time to evacuate because, unlike the Vreth Dominion, we don't consider civilian and support personnel legitimate military targets. A pause, measured and deliberate. This strike was not a desperate act. It was a demonstration. We know where your stations are. We know your patrol rotations. We know your supply chains. We have friends now, and they have been watching you for a very long time. Another pause. You came to our world and told us compliance was the only path to survival. We've reconsidered your math. This is what happens when you declare war on humanity. We are just getting started. She cut the channel. Jump, she said. The Defiance folded into FTL. The message reached Dominion High Command 6 hours later. Executor Supreme Von Kathek received it in his personal chambers, relayed by an aide who looked visibly shaken. An expression Von Kathek had never seen on that particular aide's face, because the aide had served him for 20 years and had seen nothing worth being shaken by. He watched the recording 3 times. Then he called an emergency session of the High Command. All 12 executors gathered in person for the first time in 40 years, the last occasion having been a celebration of the Dominion's 300th anniversary of expansion. The chamber, built for triumph and administration, felt suddenly, strangely different. Smaller, perhaps. Or perhaps it was just that the executors sitting around its great circular table looked different than they had 40 years ago. Less certain. They were inside our territory, Executor 4th Hesfron said. The words sounded like they needed help making sense. They were inside our territory. And they evacuated the crew first, added Executor 7th, whose name Von Kathek could suddenly not remember because he had never needed to pay attention to Executor 7th before, had never needed to pay attention to anything that carefully before. They evacuated the crew. They warned them. They waited. Why does that matter? Snapped Executor 3rd. Because it means they can make choices, said Executor 7th quietly. Under fire in enemy territory on a strike mission, they stop to make a moral choice. That's not how desperate species act. That's how confident ones do. The room was very quiet. Von Kathek looked at the recordings of the depot's destruction, the clean, professional precision of it, the total absence of wasted shots, the evacuation pods already clear before the first strike hit. He thought about the battle report from the first engagement, the synchronized strike timing that had cracked the unbroken vow. He thought about the 72-hour response, the tone of it, the calm that hadn't been shock or denial, but something he was only now identifying correctly. Preparation. How many species, he said slowly, in 300 years have struck us in our own territory? Silence. None, Executor 2nd said finally. None, Von Kathek repeated. He looked around the table, at the faces of the most powerful beings in 30 light-years of space, who were sitting very carefully, very still, with the specific stillness of people who had just heard a sound they didn't recognize in a house they thought was empty. We may, he said, with the enormous difficulty of someone speaking a sentence that had never previously needed to exist, have made an error. Dominion's response to humiliation was overwhelming force. This had always worked before. Von Kathek assembled the reclamation fleet, 94 warships drawn from 6 different sector commands, the largest single military force the Dominion had deployed in 60 years. It was not assembled with subtlety. It was announced, its formation broadcast on Dominion military channels with the transparent intention that the enemy would intercept the communications and understand, in the clearest possible terms, what was coming. It was meant to be terrifying. It was meant to end the war in one engagement, one overwhelming, inescapable demonstration of the true scale of Dominion power that would finally, make these humans perform the rational calculation that every other species had performed and accept the inevitable. The announcement worked exactly as Tarek had anticipated. They want us to see it, he said, standing before his command staff in the war room, the holographic display showing the reclamation fleet's projected trajectory, inbound, 12 days out, heading directly for Earth. They want us frightened. They want us calculating odds and finding them impossible. He paused. What they actually want is for us to defend Earth, to sit here and wait and let them bring the war to us on their terms. He turned away from the display. We are not going to do that. The plan he had built over the 3 weeks since the Keth 7 strike was the most complex military operation in human history. It had been designed in collaboration with Selareth's Thavari network, CHRR Kran's sane logistics specialists, and the Oro Resistance, who turned out, beneath their quiet exterior, to possess a gift for tactical deception that had kept them alive under the Dominion for 200 years. The Jupiter Relay Point, a stretch of space near the gas giant's trailing Trojan asteroids, was chosen as the engagement location for reasons that took Tarek 4 hours to explain in full to his command staff, and that boiled down at their core to 3 facts. Excellent sensor occlusion from the asteroid debris, gravitational conditions that favored the human fleet's shorter-range weapons, and critically, the Dominion would choose it themselves. The intelligence they had been fed through carefully managed leaks suggested it was Earth's primary defensive fallback position. The reclamation fleet arrived at Jupiter exactly on schedule. It found a human defensive line of 62 vessels, every warship Earth could put in space, plus 9 ships borrowed from the Thavari Resistance, running under dummy transponders, smaller than the Dominion force, outgunned, by any conventional analysis overmatched. Executor Admiral Cresval, commanding the reclamation fleet from the bridge of the Heaven's Judgment, looked at the human line and felt the first distant edge of something he dismissed immediately as irrelevant. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. The math was clear. He gave the order to advance. The battle opened with a Dominion barrage that would have ended the engagement in 12 minutes against any opponent they had previously encountered. Against the human line, it opened 12 minutes of the most ferocious close-range combat in recorded Dominion military history. Human ships took fire and kept firing. The synchronized strike pattern that had cracked the unbroken vow had been refined. Dr. Nair had spent 6 weeks improving it, and it now worked reliably against any Vreth shielding configuration. Human pilots, trained in gravitational combat around gas giants in simulation for 5 years, used Jupiter's gravity wells in ways Dominion pilots had no protocol for. Ships that should have fled pulled toward the planet, using the gradient to slingshot around Dominion flanking movements. 3 human vessels were destroyed in the first exchange. 2 more followed in the second. But the Dominion line was not advancing cleanly. It was getting tangled, drawn deeper into the asteroid debris field than Cresval had intended. Its flanking elements separated by more distance than tactical coordination allowed for, its targeting systems confused by sensor occlusion, and the constantly changing positions of human ships that refused to hold still and fight predictably. "Sir," Cresval's tactical officer said, with a new, careful tension in her voice, "I'm reading energy signatures at bearing." The Thavari ascendant dropped out of stealth. Then the wings of the Seine. Then 7 Oro gunships that had been hiding in the asteroid debris for 6 hours, cold and silent and completely invisible. The Dominion's tactical computer, running engagement probability models, updated 3 times in 5 seconds as the Allied ships appeared. Each update revised the outcome of the battle in the wrong direction. "What are those ships?" Cresval demanded. His intelligence officer stared at her displays. They're Thavari and Seine, and Executor Admiral, those are Oro. Those are our subjects. Those are our former subjects." The Thavari commander's voice came over the open channel, calm, clear, carrying the particular weight of someone who had been waiting 160 years to say what she was about to say. "The Thavari Resistance Fleet declares its active support for the United Earth Defense Command. As of this moment, we are no longer your subjects, Cresval. We are your enemy." The Dominion's left flank, which had been relying on 3 ships that had been secretly detached from the Vreth order of battle by sane double agents within the Dominion's logistics network, suddenly had a gap in it. The human line didn't hesitate. It pivoted with a coordination that spoke of a plan, not a reaction, and pushed directly through the gap. The Heaven's Judgment took 3 synchronized strikes to its port shielding in 0.28 seconds. Its primary shield array failed completely. Cresval watched his damage reports with the growing, nauseating sensation of a commander whose mental model of the battle was simply no longer connected to the battle that was actually happening. He had come to break a human defensive line. He had found himself in the center of a coordinated multi-species ambush that had clearly been planned for weeks, that had used his own arrogance as a weapon against him, that had fed him the engagement location, and then built a trap around his arrival. "Sir," his tactical officer said, with a flatness that was its own kind of alarm, "the patience of Dominion is retreating. The 3rd flanking group is." He heard it in her voice before she finished. The 3rd flanking group wasn't retreating. It was routing. The difference was significant. Retreat was organized. Routing was a fleet deciding, collectively and without orders, that the calculation had changed. The Dominion's reclamation fleet had never routed. In 300 years, no Dominion force had ever left a battlefield in disorder. The Heaven's Judgment left the battlefield in disorder. Behind it, the Allied fleet held its position, damaged, depleted, having lost 12 ships and thousands of crew, and did not pursue. Vasquez, commanding the human line, gave the order to hold with the specific, disciplined restraint of someone who understood that winning meant not making the mistake victory invited. In the Dominion, the propaganda networks had no framework for what had happened. The reclamation fleet's routing was classified at the highest level, but classified information had a way of moving through a civilization of subjugated species with an extensive and highly motivated intelligence network. Within 48 hours, on 100 worlds across 30 light-years, beings who had spent generations under the Dominion's control heard the word spreading. Humanity was winning. The Dominion had sent its largest fleet in 60 years, and humanity and its allies had sent it home. For the first time in living memory, across 100 subjugated worlds, the word that had been too dangerous to speak out loud was being whispered in kitchens and barracks and underground meeting rooms. Maybe the negotiating station orbited a neutral star that belonged to no one. It had been a trading post once, a relic of the pre-Dominion era, when the species of this sector had moved freely between their worlds. The Vreth had taken it over, cataloged it, found it strategically unimportant, and largely forgotten about it. Now it was the site of the first formal negotiations the Dominion had entered in 300 years as anything other than the dictating party. Admiral Ambassador Quaim Assant arrived on the station in full dress uniform, human military formal wear, which involved considerably more color and considerably less intimidation than Vreth's ceremonial dress, but which he wore with the quiet authority of a man who had learned that confidence was not a uniform. Beside him walked a small delegation, General Tariq, Dr. Nair, who had been given the title of technical attaché and who looked slightly uncomfortable with the diplomacy but very comfortable with the uniform, and 3 representatives from the Allied resistance. Selarath walked in her own people's traditional formal colors, colors that had been banned on Thavari worlds for 60 years. CHRR Kairan wore the markings of the Sane Free Council, a governing body that had existed in exile for 4 generations, and was, as of 3 weeks ago, formally recognized by Earth as the legitimate government of the Sane people. The Oro representative, the same small, rust-scaled delegate who had spent 6 days in a life pod to attend the meeting in the shadow of the brown dwarf, walked with his chin raised in a way that his people had not been permitted to walk in 2 centuries. Executor Supreme Von Kathek was already in the chamber when they arrived. He looked older than his official imagery suggested, though Assant suspected the last several months had done that, rather than the official imagery being inaccurate. He was flanked by 6 executors and an extensive military advisory staff, all of them watching the human delegation enter with expressions that ran a carefully managed gamut between controlled hostility and barely concealed uncertainty. Nobody had briefed them on what to expect from this meeting, because the Dominion had no template for it. They had conducted 300 years of what they called negotiations, but which had in practice been the administrative processing of surrender. They had no vocabulary for sitting across from an enemy that hadn't been defeated. Assant sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table, a human gesture of openness, which he had considered carefully before deciding to keep, because he wanted nothing about this meeting to be ambiguous. "Executor Supreme," he said, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Von Kathek's mandibles moved in the Vreth equivalent of a carefully neutral expression. "We are here," he said, "to discuss terms." "We are," Assant agreed. "You will present your demands." "We will present a proposal," Assant said. "There's a difference." He slid the document across the table. It was a physical copy, printed on actual paper, a human affectation that had been deliberate and considered, and it was titled in both Vreth Standard and 26 other languages, the Compact of Sovereign Worlds. Von Kathek looked at it without touching it for a long moment. Then he picked it up. The room was very quiet as he read. His advisors craned to see. Occasionally a mandible twitched, the Vreth equivalent of a raised eyebrow, Assant had been told. The silence stretched for several minutes. "You are not demanding reparations," Von Kathek said finally, not quite a question. "No. You are not demanding territorial concessions. No, you are not demanding the dissolution of the Dominion. No, Asant folded his hands. We are not interested in your destruction, Executor Supreme. We are not interested in revenge or reparations or subjugating you the way you subjugated others. We are interested in a specific and limited set of things. He held up one finger. The immediate and unconditional release of all annexed peoples, full self-governance, no tribute, no military occupation. A second finger. The formal recognition of the Thavari, Sane, and Oro peoples as sovereign nations, with all rights thereto. A third. A mutual defense framework that prevents any single entity, including humanity, from attempting what the Dominion attempted. He lowered his hand. That's it. Von Kathek stared at him. That is the entirety of your conditions. That's the entirety of our conditions. After everything, the executor began and stopped, restarted. We bombed your cities, we killed your people. Yes, Asant said simply. You did. We'd prefer you not do it again. The compact makes that structurally difficult. He paused. We understand that what you built took centuries. We understand that dismantling it, genuinely dismantling it, not just the surface, will take time and will be politically difficult for you, and that there will be factions within your government who will resist. The compact includes provisions for a transition period and a joint oversight commission. He met von Kathek's compound eyes steadily. We are offering you a way out that preserves your civilization. Not because you deserve mercy. I will not insult the people in this room by pretending the history isn't what it is. But because a war that continues until one side is destroyed helps no one in this sector. Executor Third, seated to von Kathek's right, leaned forward. And if we refuse? General Tariq, who had been silent until this moment, spoke without raising his voice. Then we continue. We are better at it than we were 6 months ago, and we were better 6 months ago than we were 6 months before that. The trend does not favor delay. It was not a threat. It was stated as a fact, the way a doctor might state a prognosis, not cruel, not comfortable, simply honest. Von Kathek looked at the compact again. He looked at the Allied delegation, the Thavari representative in her band colors, the Sane Council member, the small Oro who had traveled alone through the dark because he believed a species he'd never met was worth believing in. He looked at Asant, who was watching him with the particular patience of someone who was genuinely, profoundly difficult to exhaust. He thought about the reclamation fleet. He thought about Keth 7. He thought about a species that had been given 72 hours and had spent them building. He thought about the report on his desk, delivered that morning by his intelligence chief with the specific expression of someone delivering news they found deeply unsettling. That showed 4 more species within the Dominion's territory making contact with the Earth Resistance Network. 4 more species watching to see if this was real. He thought about what happened if it was real. What happened if humanity won completely? What happened to a civilization that had never lost if it lost completely, with no pathway back? He picked up the pen, also paper, also physical, also deliberate. He understood now, and he signed. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Selarath made a sound that no translation system could render precisely, something between a breath and a cry, containing in it 160 years of her people's history, the weight of generations born into servitude, the specific, shattering sensation of a thing you had stopped letting yourself believe in suddenly, irrevocably becoming real. The sane delegate's 6 limbs trembled in a ripple pattern their culture used for profound emotion. The Oro representative lowered his head for a moment, then raised it. Asant kept his expression composed, or tried to. He was a diplomat and a soldier, and he had held it together through 6 months of the hardest thing humanity had collectively endured since the darkest years of the previous century. But across the table, a young aide to the Executor Supreme leaned close to von Kathek and whispered something. Asant caught it because his translation earpiece was still active. "Who are these people?" the aide asked. Von Kathek was quiet for a moment, looking at the signed document in front of him. The document that was, in 300 years of Dominion history, the first thing he had ever signed that was not a declaration of someone else's subjugation. "The species," he said very quietly, "that we should never have contacted." Outside the station's viewport, the stars were the same as they had always been, cold and distant and indifferent to everything that happened beneath them. But in the light from 100 worlds, something was changing. The news was already moving, faster than ships, faster than official channels, moving the way important truths move through societies that have been waiting for them. The compact had been signed. On Thavari Prime, where children had grown up never knowing their own flag, someone would hang one tonight. In the sane labor districts, someone would stop working for the first time in 4 generations and breathe. On the Oro homeworld, in a language that the Dominion had spent 2 centuries trying to erase, an elder would find the words for a story worth telling, one that started in darkness and ended with a small blue planet that had looked at the most powerful empire in the known galaxy, been given an ultimatum, and very calmly, very deliberately told it no. The war was over. Humanity had won. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the most advanced, but because they were the species that had spent its entire existence being pushed to the edge of oblivion and had decided, somewhere in the long and painful accumulation of its history, that the edge was just where you stood before you pushed back. Asant walked out of the negotiating chamber into a corridor where his team was waiting. Tariq was already on a comm to Earth. Dr. Nair had her tablet out and was running calculations for the first joint technical exchange program because apparently she had written the framework during the flight over. Selarath fell into step beside him. "Admiral Ambassador," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Of course." "Your people, your history." She paused, searching for words. "Did you always know you would survive? Was there ever certainty?" Asant thought about it honestly. "No," he said, "never certainty. There were times we were sure we wouldn't." He glanced at her. "But we have this, I don't know what to call it, a reflex maybe. When things get worst, we get stubborn. It's not rational. It's not strategic. We've lost a lot of people to it." He was quiet for a moment. "But we're here." Selareth walked beside him in silence for a while. "We will study you," she said finally. "My people for generations." A pause, not out of fear. "I know," Asant said. "Out of gratitude," she said, "and something else, something we had forgotten." "What's that?" She looked at him, and in her eyes, large and amber and carrying the weight of a century and a half, there was something clear and simple and extraordinary. "That it's possible," she said, "to win." "And